Okay, well, we've been talking about signs, and the very best signs are ones that are difficult to miss. And even though some signs are massive, they have flashing lights, they are impossible to miss, still somehow we seem able to miss obvious signs. And nearly 800 years ago, the people that lived in this city decided to build a sign, a cathedral. Why? The sign points to the reason why. They decided to build a sign so that people would know who to look to. It points where to look. They would know who to go to. They would know who this group of people had found that gave them meaning and purpose in life. The sign points to the answer. It's obvious, you can't miss it. The people who built it wanted to build something that would be very difficult to miss. They wanted to make sure that others discovered what they'd found. And yet it's possible to see the sign and to completely miss what it's pointing to. In fact, there are people who walk past it every day and can't see what this sign points to and has pointed to for hundreds of years. Now, we're working our way through the gospel, the good news of Jesus that was written by John. John was Jesus' closest friend, his longest serving disciple. And as part of his eyewitness account of the life of Jesus, John gives us 7 signs, 7 things that Jesus did that point really obviously and really clearly to who he was. And John's belief is that if you are truly open, if you're really looking, if you're paying attention, it would be impossible to miss these signs. And if you follow where the sign is pointing, you will be able to work out what an appropriate response is to the person and the message of Jesus. So, 7 signs. Number 1, Jesus turned water into wine, gallons of wine. Number 2, Jesus healed a man who was on the verge of death without even being in the same vicinity. Number 3, Jesus healed someone who had been crippled for 38 years, with just a few words. Number 4, Jesus took some bread rolls and some fish, and he multiplied it into enough food to feed a crowd of thousands. Number 5, Jesus walked on water. He spoke to a storm in the middle of the sea, and instantly it stopped. And then he took a boat that was miles from shore to the dock in just a split second, just a blink of an eye. It went from there to there. Number 6, Jesus gave sight to someone who'd been born blind, someone who didn't have the apparatus to be able to see. Jesus gifted them sight. It was a creative miracle. 6 signs so far. Now, if you have missed all 6 of those signs, maybe because you weren't here when we talked about them, or maybe you don't really get what those signs are pointing to, there's one more. The 7th sign. John has saved the biggest, the boldest, the most obvious sign till last. And that's what we're going to look at today. So we're in John chapter 11. And this morning, Claire and Josiah are going to read for us. We're going to read from verse 1 through to the end of verse 44. So hand over to you two.
Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. When Jesus heard that, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Mary and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place that he was. And after this he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and you're going to go there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, but he who sees, because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. These things he said, and after that he said to them, Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. Then the disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get well. But Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought he was speaking about taking a rest and sleep. Then Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. Then Then Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away. And many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Now Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary was sitting in the house. Now Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world."
And when she had said these things, she went her way and secretly called Mary her sister, saying, "The teacher has come and is calling for you." As soon as she heard that, she arose quickly and came to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the town, but was in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and comforting her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, followed her, saying, "She is going to the tomb to weep there." Then, when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." And some of them said, "Could not this man, who opened the eyes of the blind, also have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, "Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me, and I know that you always hear me. But because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me." Now when he had said these things, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Loose him and let him go."
Thank you so much. So, the best signs are really obvious and difficult to miss. John has given us 7 signs so that we can work out who is this man called Jesus. What does it mean that he came to earth and he did what he did? And so here we have the 7th sign. Someone being raised from the dead. Now we know from the other accounts that we have of the life of Jesus that Jesus raised other people from the dead as well as Lazarus. So we know that there was a widow in the town of Nain whose son had died, her only son, and as the funeral procession was leaving the town, Jesus stopped the procession and he touched the coffin. And in touching the coffin, that man came back to life. Now, Jewish religious tradition was that you had to bury someone before sundown on the day that they died. So that man had not yet been dead 24 hours. Jesus also raised a little girl from the dead. Her father was the leader of the synagogue in Capernaum, and his name was Jairus. And Jesus went to Jairus' house. The funeral hadn't even really got started yet. They were just beginning to sort of warm up. And Jesus interrupted proceedings, and he raised the little girl from the dead. She'd probably been dead just a few hours. John was present at both of those dead raisings. But he chooses to highlight this one as being in a different league from those other ones. And here's the reason why. It's because it happened 4 days after Lazarus died. The significance of that is that in Jewish superstition, when somebody died, their spirit would hang around for 3 days in the hope that they might come back round, that they might somehow not really be dead, and it could re-enter the body and their life could continue. But at the end of the third day, that spirit would depart permanently. And at that point, the only person with the authority to call that spirit back into that body was God himself. At that point, the only person who would be able to override death would be God himself. So, John goes out of his way to say to us, this was 4 days after Lazarus died. Now, we should do the maths, because John tells us that Jesus delayed in actually responding to this request. But if you actually look at the maths and work it out, by the time Jesus got the message that Lazarus was really seriously ill, Lazarus had already died. It took time to get the message to Jesus. The maths works like this. So, we're told that Jesus was given an urgent call to go and help Lazarus, and he waited 2 days. Then he traveled to Bethany, and when he got to Bethany, he found out that Lazarus had already been dead 4 days. So we count back 4 days, and we find out that actually by the time the message had come to Jesus, Lazarus had already died. And Lazarus' sisters, Martha and Mary, recognized that. That's why they said to Jesus, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. Well, they didn't say, if you had hurried, if you hadn't had an extra 2 days annual leave, if you had walked faster. They didn't say any of those things because they realized that the message hadn't got there in time. And did you spot that both sisters said exactly the same thing to Jesus? If you had been here, my brother would not have died. That phrase that we translate as if captures a little bit of what they're saying, but it would probably be more helpful for us in English to have if only you had been here. Because there's no anger in what they're saying, there's no accusation in what they're saying. They're just saying, Jesus, if only you'd been here. If we hadn't had to send a message to get to you, if only you'd been here, we believe that you have the power and you had the goodness to be able to deal with the situation that Lazarus is in. He wouldn't have died if you'd been here. If only you'd been here. Now we can relate to that, can't we? We can relate to if onlys. We live with if onlys. If only I had known. If only I had acted sooner. If only I hadn't opened my mouth. If only I had spent more time. If only I had acted straight away. If only. And that's what Jesus speaks to interrupt, because behind that phrase, behind that mindset, is a belief that sometimes things happen and we pass a point of no return. Sometimes things happen and there's no way of undoing what has happened. Sometimes things happen and for whatever reason God can't or he won't undo what has happened. And so we live with if-onlys. And Jesus wants to interrupt that way of thinking. And he does so by saying, I am the resurrection and the life. I have authority over death and I have authority over life. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. What Jesus is saying is, if you trust your life to me, I will give you a new life. You will be born again. You will enter into the kingdom of God. You'll be adopted into God's family. You may die in this life, but you will die having received a brand new life. It doesn't stop there. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. So, if you put your trust in me, Jesus says, I will gift you a brand new life. And if you live in me and you believe in me, that brand new life will be an eternal one. What Jesus is saying is that when you trust your life to God, everything stays on the table. Nothing is ever off the table. If you trust your life to God, because he has authority over death and authority over life, you never pass a point of no return. You never get to a place where there isn't something that God could do to change what has happened. Because of who God is, those if-onlys never need to be thought. Because the things that we think of as now being too late, the things that we think of as now being beyond redemption, can still be changed because of who God is. What Jesus is saying is, if you put your trust in God, if you live in Him, it doesn't matter what happens to you. If you die, He can call you back into life, or He can take you into eternal life. So whatever happens to you, the outcome will be life. It will be life here, or it will be life there eternally. And then, having explained that, having unpacked that, Jesus then proves that what He said is true. He raises Lazarus from the dead. He demonstrates that He wasn't just saying something that could be put on posters and put on paintings and sort of put on cards to send to people, but He was actually saying something that really described who He was, the power that He had, the authority that He had, the goodness that He had, and His willingness to intervene in a situation. Now, the last thing that I want to say this morning is to point out to you the attitude of the two sisters. So, Martha comes to Jesus. Jesus, if only you'd been here. I know that if you were here, this would never have happened, because I know that you carry authority over sickness. But she goes on, she says more than that. She says, I know that you are the Messiah. I know that you're God's chosen king for the earth. I know that you can do anything. I know that even now, whatever you ask, the Father will do. And Mary, she just comes, and she falls at Jesus' feet in worship. That word isn't kind of like collapsing in grief. The word that is used there is worship. She comes and she falls at His feet. So you have two different responses in a moment of grief, when their lives have just fallen apart. Someone that they love, someone that is dear to them, has died. And in that moment of grief, both of them in different ways choose to express to Jesus, we don't understand what has happened. This really, really hurts. But we choose to believe in you. We choose to trust you. We choose to worship you. Do you know, so often when bad stuff happens to us, we blame God, we criticize Him, we get angry with Him, we distance ourselves from Him. But not Martha and Mary. They chose to still believe in Jesus, to still trust Him, to still love Him, even though bad stuff had happened, even though they didn't understand why it would happen to them. And that is the gospel. The good news that Jesus brought from heaven is that in life there will be twists and turns, but there is one that you can trust. There is one that you can give your life to, and if you live in Him, if you believe in Him, then at no point is anything off the table. Because of who He is, He's outside of time, He is over death, and He has the power of life. And so because of who He is, everything is possible at any point. And so you can trust your life to Jesus. You can live in Him. You can believe in Him. If you had the option to believe in someone who had authority over time and over death and over life, why would you trust your life to anyone or anything other than that? That's the invitation of the gospel, that you're invited into relationship with that one. Not just as some minion. He says, come, I call you friends. He says, come, you're my brothers and sisters. You get the same inheritance as me. Come, you're my bride. That's the gospel. That's what we're invited to. That's what this sign points to.